Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, I'm a professor in the Department of Renewable Resources here at the University of Alberta, and I'm a forest ecologist with particular interests in plants, in understory plant diversity and response to disturbance. So I gave a subtitle to my talk, which is Stepping Stones to Omniscience for Scientists and Regulators, because I think developing understanding resilience in itself, and particularly developing criteria and indicators for it, really is a spiritual quest to see into the future. I'm going to approach this in three parts quickly. First of all, very briefly go over again defining and recognizing resilience in ecosystems, then talk about what approaches we could take to defining C&I for resilience, and then I'm going to spend a little bit of time at the end talking about what I think we can learn from natural and managed ecosystems and use those to develop C&I. Okay, so we're going to go through the definition of resilience again. I think there's a lot of things I'm going to talk about that I've heard about already, and so I'm going to go with great minds think alike, as opposed to the fools seldom differ paradigm. And it'll be slightly different, and if everybody defines these things slightly differently throughout the day, then we will have a global vision by the end of the day, I'm confident. So we know resilience is emergent property of an ecosystem, its ability to self-organize when challenged with a disturbance or stress. And we can have the little diagram here that's a little variation on what Clive had. We have these troughs or valleys and mountains, and these are ecological states. And in my definition, this isn't necessarily completely stable. This can be moving around, maybe rolling around in the bottom of a bowl kind of concept. So it could be going through the successional stages that Clive was talking about, but it's still in that general ecological state. So maybe it's a conifer forest, it might be a young one or an old one, but it's still in that general state. And resilience, we can define as the ability to return to the prior state following this challenge with a disturbance or stress. So it's something like this. It can get pushed by this bowling ball, which represents the disturbance or stress, and get pushed up over here. And then it has the capacity to come back to where it was. So that's resilience. And then we can look at resistance. I'm calling it resistance. It's engineering resilience, as Clive called it. It's often also called resistance in the ecological literature. And this is the ability to not change. So when the bowling ball comes and hits you, then you don't change at all. And either one or both of these, I think, are of interest in terms of what we want to achieve with our reclaimed landscapes. Now, what Suzanne was describing was really interesting, was that alternative stable states. So she was describing the situation where naturally wetlands bounce back and forth between these two states. And so this jumps over there and jumps back again multiple times, and that's a natural process. And so that requires some rethinking of our concepts, I think, of resilience and what we want to achieve in reclaimed systems. Okay, so to define resilience, how do we know we're in a resilient state, or how do we know that our ecosystem is resilient? We can define it as it's returned to the pre-disturbance state, if we're assuming that pre-disturbance state was resilient. So if our natural forest conditions are resilient due to millennia of natural selection and adaptation since glaciation, then that condition should be resilient. Or we can say it has the capacity for resilience when challenged with future disturbance and stresses. And this might mean that it can return to its pre-disturbance state. Maybe that means that it can return to its current state, whatever reclaimed state it's in at the time it experiences that disturbance. Or maybe we can just think it needs to be able to return to or go to some desired state that we define based on our values and objectives for that particular piece of land. Okay, so how do we recognize resilience in a reclaimed ecosystem? What does a resilient reclaimed forest look like? It's going to be a function of ecological, what I call ecological structure and ecological function. So here, in terms of structure for a forest, I'm talking about properties like this. So the size of the trees and their age structure, species diversity and composition and abundances, the spatial arrangement of these within the forest stand, the properties of the soils and the forest floor, and the deadwood. So it's sort of the physical and biotic structure of the forest. And then we have function, ecological function. This is really the ecological work that the system does. Fixing carbon, cycling water and nutrients, cycling those nutrients and carbon through decomposition, interactions between species, herbivory, predation, competition, and trophic interactions. Okay, and then there's complex interactions between structure and function. So they're not independent of one another. So the size, age, structure, and species diversity of the biota are going to be driving some of these ecological cycles, nutrient and water cycles, but in turn, nutrient and water cycles are going to be influencing the species that exist there. So it goes back and forth, and the processes that Clive was talking about are also behind this. So we can say, size, age, structure, species composition of a system is a function of another set of ecological processes, which would include immigration, emigration, recolonization potential, dispersal, regeneration, those kinds of ecological processes that are going to put these things in place and then allow them to start playing out these interactions. Okay, all of these have spatial and temporal variability, and these are scale dependent, and other people talked about this. These are going to need to be considered in different ways depending on which spatial and temporal scale we're thinking about. Okay, so let's look at this diagram that's going to represent spatial and temporal variability in ecosystem structure and function. These things are naturally variable. So we could say we have sort of very simplified two-dimensional graph here with structure and function and some condition, and this is after a presentation and some writings that Phil Burton has done on concepts of resilience to reclaimed ecosystems. And so we can have these dots, and they represent ecosystem states, or more particularly, they represent a particular site that has a particular ecosystem state. So it has certain properties of structure and function, and they're variable along these two dimensions. Then we could say, if we draw this sort of space around all of these, that would be natural range of variability in the boreal. So anything within this space along this ecosystem structure and function dimensions could be something that we would find naturally in the boreal region. And that could be broken down into sort of some ellipses of the conditions in which we find things, and these might be ecosystem types, or for example, these could be considered to be ecosites, and so you have an ecosite space here, and then you have a particular site that occupies that ecosite space, and it has the capacity to move. These are going to be moving around over time, going through that successional dynamics that Clive was talking about. They're going to be moving. Sometimes they might move right to the limits. Maybe sometimes they might even move into another circle. So maybe if these were Suzanne's wetlands, one that was over here would jump over there and then jump back again. And then if we had a really severe disturbance, either a natural disturbance or a severe disturbance like digging a giant hole in the ground, then we've moved it way outside the space over to there. Okay, so that's sort of a concept of what we might be thinking about as the things that we'd want to look at to recognize resilience, and introducing the concept that these are highly variable in time and space. And let's think about now how we can approach using or choosing criterion and indicators that would tell us that our reclaimed ecosystem was resilient. So first, let's make sure we're on the same page in terms of what the criteria and indicators are. So a criteria is a category. So criteria is the plural, first of all. And these are categories of structure or function relevant to achieving the objective. So if our objective is ecosystem resilience, we need to know that that's our objective and have it clear in our mind in order to pick criteria. So they're going to be categories of ecological structure or function that we think will be relevant to achieving our objective of ecosystem resilience. And then indicators, on the other hand, are underneath this in a hierarchy, and they're measurable attributes. So they need to be things that we could actually go out and collect data on and quantify in some way that will allow us to determine if a certain criterion has been met. So for every criteria, there should be a few indicators that tell us that we can go out and measure these things, and if we measure them and they conform to a certain standard or benchmark that we've established, then we know that we've met our criteria. Okay, so for this, we need to know what the standard or benchmark is that we want to achieve. So we have to have something to measure these against. Okay, so we can go to this often quoted phrase from PM line approvals: the reclaimed soils and landforms are capable of supporting a self-sustaining, locally common boreal forest. So this sets out a pretty clear objective of what we're trying to achieve, and then maybe we need to add that is resilient, or maybe self-sustaining means it's resilient, but we need to read resilience into this definition. Okay, so SEMA's already done quite a bit of work on developing criteria and indicators for mine reclamation certification, and this report is now out and provides a really excellent framework, both an organizational approach to developing C&I and a framework for developing C&I that I think is really useful and certainly can inform our attempts to develop C&I for resilience. So they identified 3 objectives, and they had 16 criteria and 44 indicators, and then they talked about those indicators in terms of gaps and knowledge and what the pluses and minuses are. And in particular, they identified issues with these indicators. A lot had to do with benchmarks, knowing what the benchmark or the target was going to be for a given indicator. Some issues around methods of measuring these. If you're going to have indicators that are measurable, then you have to come to common understanding and common practice in terms of how you're going to measure those. And then there's also issues of alignment with approval. So do the indicators that we think are important actually going to line up with approvals and regulations? So some of the, this is out of that report again, the objective here, criteria here. So we see big objectives and then the criteria that we think are going to take us to that objective. And you can see here, under the objective, natural ecosystem functions are established on the reclaimed landscapes. Reclaimed ecosystems display characteristics of resilience to natural disturbances. And I suspect bullet 2.5 is why we're all here today, or at least certainly that was a motivating factor for undertaking this exercise today. So we have something here that says that a criterion would be resilience, to know that we've met this higher objective. Okay, so now the question is, which aspects of structure and function confer resilience, and what would be the benchmarks for those? So how do we know what things we need to be measuring and what condition they should be displaying for us to say that we've met our objective or that we've achieved our criterion of resilience? So I'm going to go through this and break it down into 3 components and really just use examples of what this might look like. And I've kind of broken down that phrase of capable of supporting a self-sustaining, locally common boreal forest, and broken that down into 3 pieces. So first of all, what makes an ecosystem resilient in terms of capability? So its capability to support this kind of forest. So it's not saying it is supporting that, it's saying it's capable of doing that. Okay? So we can go to the literature, and as Clive mentioned, and he's going to be working on this further, there's a lot of information and debate in the literature about the relationship between different aspects of ecosystem structure and function and resilience. What properties confer resilience? And there's actually, in some sectors, huge debates in the literature about whether diversity confers resilience or productivity confers resilience. And I'm not going to wade too far into that. I'm going to go based on what I know is in the literature, and also with just some ecological reasoning, because I think everything in ecology is just common sense, and so we can reason this out because we know a lot about ecosystems. We've been studying them for decades and decades. So in terms of capability, what makes a system capable, I would say we have to start with the soil, obviously. The soil is what starts this, and as Rob pointed out quite importantly, is that landform and hydrology underlie this. So landform and hydrology underlie the soil, and the soil underlies the capability of the system. So if we're looking at the aspects of structure and function that would be relevant to resilience or capability, we have to look at things like this. Soil moisture holding capacity. Can this system deliver moisture to grow vegetation? Can it deliver nutrients? Does it have nutrient availability? Are nutrients flowing in order to support development of vegetation? What are the conditions of the soil? Is the soil pH? Is the soil salinity? Is the chemistry of that soil appropriate to support a certain type of vegetation? Soil depth. Is the soil depth sufficient to support rooting of trees, for example? And the soil biota, this little guy here, and microbes, I couldn't get a picture of a microbe, but they're going to be driving delivery of nutrients and also development of the soil over time. So the development of the soil is going to be a dynamic process in a reclaimed ecosystem, and it needs to be moving forward in a way where it's actually perhaps increasing its capability in the future. So I kind of summarize these things, the capability. If you were looking at this in a business case sense, you'd maybe be looking at what your potential cash flow was. And your potential cash flow would dictate what you might be able to achieve. Okay, so what makes an ecosystem resilient in terms of self-sustainability? So what does self-sustainability mean? It could mean it has the ability to keep working into the future without us holding its hand, without us continually providing interventions, without us weeding it, fertilizing it, watering it, adding species into it. It's going to keep going into the future. And if we look in the very long-term future, then self-sustainability would mean it's resilient because it has that capability to keep functioning on into the future, even when challenged with some disturbances and stresses. Okay, so what aspects would make it resilient in terms of self-sustainability? So here I would say we're looking at things that are more like, not like cash flow, more like your money in the bank. Well, how much savings do you have? Can you withstand a recession? Can you withstand getting laid off from your job or not? So that's less about cash flow and how much you have in the bank. So nutrient capital. Now we're not talking about delivering nutrients on an ongoing basis. We're talking about what the total nutrient capital of the system is. What has built up there that could be used and made available into the future. Ecological legacies are incredibly important here. So what's the total biomass on the system? Biomass is building up carbon. Biomass is building up nutrients that will be part of this nutrient capital. Litter, forest floor, dead wood. All of that is part of the live and dead biomass that's building up the capital to support future development of the system. Plant propagules will be important. Do you have propagules on the site that can support regeneration when plants die or when they're disturbed or they die due to stress? Do you have seeds? Do you have roots of aspen? Do you have things like that that are going to allow the system to grow and recover its vegetation in response to those stresses? And finally, what's the recolonization potential? What's the ability for species to come onto that site on an ongoing basis or to recolonize that site if they were lost as a result of the disturbance and stress? And now we need to start thinking about a larger landscape scale. What is the landscape matrix of disturbed and undisturbed sites? Are our disturbed sites connected to an undisturbed landscape? As Simon mentioned, is there a source of native species nearby that can get onto the site and recolonize it? So here we need to start looking at multiple scales. Okay, and finally, which aspects of structure and function confer resilience when we're talking about the biotic makeup? So I had a little trouble saying that, I had trouble wording this, so I took this tack. How does the biotic makeup confer resilience? So how does the biota on the site influence what the resilience of the system might be? And so first of all, we're going to talk about what the species makeup of the site, particularly diversity. So there's lots of information in the literature that suggests that diversity is going to confer resilience in an ecosystem, diversity of species, and also diversity of functional groups. But I caution not to take this do casually, because it's not a situation necessarily where more is better and higher diversity is better. We could have a system that was filled with a huge mix of native species and weedy species and was highly, highly diverse. That's not necessarily the diversity that's going to confer resilience. So we need to have some relevant benchmark that tells us what condition of diversity it is that's going to make the system resilient. So it's not more is better, but we do need to think about having a diversity of species there, having a diversity of functional groups there, but also importantly is which species are there. It's not just how many, it's which species, how are they functioning? Are they native species? Are they genetically adapted? And then, rather than just looking at the species composition overall, we can focus on some species that are of particular importance. So weedy species. How much do we have weedy species there? Are weedy species going to be on the site and then increase in abundance and change the condition of that ecosystem after a stress or disturbance? Keystone species we already talked about. These are species that have large ecological effect. So I know aspen is a keystone species, and that made Simon really happy. Keystone species, top predator, for example, can be a keystone species. It's driving a lot of other ecosystem functions. So having those particular species that have important ecological effects can be there. Species that are ecological engineers is another way of looking at keystone species. So having those species of particular importance, or whether species that have particular ecological effects are there or not, is really important. And then also having a concordance between the species composition and a site. They need to be aligned with one another. I'll give an example of this later. If you have a nice biological community that seems natural and it's diverse, but it's not in concordance with its site conditions or its environment, it's not going to be resilient in the long term, because it's going to be constantly getting pushed away from that condition as a result of the fact that the environment or some other conditions are pushing it in a different direction. And then I just put provision of habitat here and a picture of a bird to show that I'm not completely plant focused, but I like to think that the physical structure of the forest and the biotic composition of the plants in the forest and the structure of the landscape is what drives the wildlife species. So it's derived from those initial building blocks that you put in place. So these are the kinds of things that we could be thinking about to use as C&I of resilience. And if we go back again to the SEMA report, we have indicators here, and you'll see that a lot of these things that we mentioned are already in here as criterion indicators that could be used for reclamation certification. Soil moisture, macronutrients, pH, salinity, depth, primary productivity, plant community composition, how many weeds, diversity, richness, regeneration of trees are healthy, etc. These things have already been identified as indicators for other criteria. Equally, they could be used as criteria of resilience. So we just need to think about how we're going to use them and what we're going to use as the benchmarks or targets for these and when they're indicating resilience. Okay, and if we look, here's some more wildlife, and then we actually have down here that resilience is in one case considered as a potential indicator of achieving another objective. So it becomes a little bit circular in the end, but I think we could potentially have resilience as an indicator, but it also could be a criterion, and maybe even more importantly, it could be an objective with a series of criterion and indicators that go with it. Okay? So the question then arises, do we use criterion and indicators that tell us the ecosystem is in the condition that we believe is resilient? If we define this is what a resilient ecosystem looks like, and we're going to get C&I that tell us we're there. Or do we, can we live with ones that tell us it's heading in that direction? So are we managing the journey, as I think Clive said, we're managing the journey or managing the destination? So if we look here, if this is what, where we pushed it to as a result of a disturbance, does it need to go back to there exactly? Or are we happy if it's just in that circle somewhere? Or are we happy if it's somewhere within this total space that's defined as the boreal forest? Or are we happy if it's just heading in this direction and we're not too concerned about where it's going to wind up? Even if we took it from here and pushed it over there, if it's going back for there, that our systems can accommodate that amount of variability. So now I think, and other people have mentioned this already, is that the future disturbance and stresses that our systems are going to be exposed to are most likely going to be different than they are now. They're uncertain. We know climates are changing. We know aspects of disturbance regimes are changing, and that the future that our systems face is different than what they faced in the past. So if we look at insect disturbances, this mountain pine beetle outbreak, fires may become more or less frequent, more or less severe. We could have flooding events. We could have drought events. This is aspen dieback as a result of drought. We can have blowdown events. Any of these kinds of future disturbances might be different than they have been in the past. So how do we plan to make a system that's going to be resilient to this unknown future? And that's when we need to become omniscient. So if we look again at this space in which the boreal forest natural range of variability is, and we have these different conditions within it and variability within that, what if the future natural range of the variability in the boreal is over here? Okay, so if we had our dot here, would we be happy that it could go over there into some space where it would be accommodated in the future natural range of variability? Or do we want it back here, but say we would like it to have the capacity to move there if it had to? So it's going to be able to be resilient and fill this slightly changed and maybe larger natural range of variability that will be the future. Okay, finally, I don't know what time I'm on. What we can learn from natural and managed ecosystems. So I think we've been studying forest ecosystems in the boreal for quite a while. We've learned a lot, and I think we have a good knowledge basis to start tackling questions of defining criterion and indicators. So natural and managed ecosystems we can use to establish benchmarks and targets, know what we want to go into, particularly understand natural range of variability in time and space, understand the importance of landscape pattern and scale, so look at that larger landscape aspect, understand relationships between landform, soils, structure and function in ecosystems, and how these develop and change over time. So we have a wealth of knowledge here that we can use as a basis for establishing criterion and indicators. And I'll just give a few examples. What time am I now? I have 1 minute. Oh. So we know about landform soil vegetation relationships from ecosite classification guides. We know about relationships between forest composition and biodiversity. This is just an example. You can look at this in the handout of understanding how mixed wood composition influenced biodiversity. We look at soil-forest productivity relationships. So this is a study that Brett and I and Scott Chang did, and looking at how trees grew over time in response to different levels of salinity, so we can understand productivity potential. And then we have studies like the EMEND experiment, where we've been looking for years and years at the impacts of disturbance and recovery of forest to disturbance, so harvesting and fire. Just to close, I think I would say that perhaps the number one best indicator of resilience in a reclaimed ecosystem would be whether scientists, industry, government, and the public could stand together and say, we're willing to stand there and light that match because we're not afraid of what will happen to this system. If we're lighting a match in the boreal forest, we're not afraid. We know that system will come back. And if we were at that state in the future for a reclaimed ecosystem where we were willing to burn it down to see what would happen, that would indicate to me that we had achieved a condition of resilience.